Hello, and welcome to episode 14 of What to Read This Weekend. I am Rachel Green, and Marie Southwell, our usual host, is still on vacation. So we have Jen Hoyer here to help us out. Jen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here this week. I work at Brooklyn Public Library. I work with the Brooklyn Connections team in the Brooklyn Collection, which is Brooklyn Public Library's local history archive.
If this is your first time joining us, What to Read This Weekend is a live recorded video web series. We record on Friday afternoons at 3. You can join us there, or you can watch us on IGTV or YouTube on our website bit.ly/W2RTW2020. It's usually Marie and I, and we're sharing a few books on a theme, but since she's on vacation, we have Jen here. And our theme this week is, because Jen is at the Brooklyn Connections at Brooklyn Collection at Brooklyn Public Library, we have books set in Brooklyn. So we're going to talk about Let Me Hear a Rhyme by Tiffany D. Jackson, PSB11 by Rita Williams-Garcia, Shadowshaper by Daniel Jose Older, and Last Summer with Maizon by Jacqueline Woodson. So the first book we have is Let Me Hear a Rhyme. I just read this in paperback. It is awesome. It's about 3 teens in Brooklyn. They live in Bed-Stuy. The year is 1998. Biggie and Tupac have recently been killed. 1998, I was in high school. I remember this pretty well. So if you like hip hop, if you like music, if you like the 90s, I think you'll really like this book. So the 3 teens, one of their friends gets murdered, and they decide that they are going to release some of his music. He is like a rapper who's recently recorded in like an underground studio in Bed-Stuy. So they have his tapes, and they're going to record it and pretend that he's still alive under the name The Architect. And so they have this whole scheme about like how they're going to get him signed, even though he can never show up to any of these appointments because he has passed. But also the one thing that I didn't expect was there was like a little bit of like a crime solving mystery going on as well. And so as these characters are evolving in the story, you also are like trying to figure out this mystery. So I really loved it. I think it's hilarious that it's historical fiction because it seems like a recent memory to me, but I really liked it. I thought the teen voices were really good. It alternates between the perspectives of Quadi, Jarrell, and Jasmine, the 3 friends, and then also some like flashbacks to Steph's life, their friend. So highly recommend it. All of our books today are available through Libby or Sora. I'm going to talk about Sora at the end, but they are e-reading platforms that support audiobooks as well, and you can log in with your New York City credentials or your public library card.
You did. The first book that I am going to talk about is PSB11 by Rita Williams-Garcia. So PSB11 is actually a sequel to the book One Crazy Summer, and I would highly recommend that you read One Crazy Summer. Rachel has a copy of it, but if you haven't read it, that's okay. You don't have to have read it in order to read this one. So One Crazy Summer followed these 3 sisters from Brooklyn to California for the summer. They spend a summer with their birth mother, but in PSB11, they're back in Brooklyn. And the story mostly follows Delphine, who is the oldest sister. She's starting 6th grade. She's navigating friendships, boys, also how to be an older sister to 2 younger sisters who she's always really had to look out for. She's also grappling with a lot of family issues, like an overbearing and very opinionated grandmother. She has an uncle, her beloved uncle, who has always lived with him. He returns from fighting in the Vietnam War. So this is 1960s, but he comes back and he's really different from before. And that's something that she really has to struggle with. And also her father, who she has always lived with, decides to get a new girlfriend. And that's like an awkward thing that she and her sisters have to deal with. One other thing that I loved about this book, because I love learning about Brooklyn history when I read, is that Delphine learns about all the exciting possibilities of being a woman and being a Black girl as she watches Shirley Chisholm get elected as the first Black Congresswoman. And she uses all of that knowledge she's gaining by watching national politics to lead her class in a really fierce debate over whether a woman could ever run for president. And then through it all, one of the main themes that ties things together is the love that Delphine and her sisters have for this new phenomenon, the Jackson Five. So, can they save enough money to see them perform at Madison Square Garden? Will they ever maybe get to meet them? So the book is a lot of fun, and it also deals with a lot of really great issues that felt very, very relevant today.
I loved One Crazy Summer. I think Rita Williams-Garcia is great. And I mean, she just keeps writing.
Totally. And there's another book after this one, which I haven't read yet, but I'm excited to.
Yeah, I'm excited to read PSB 11. I don't know about this one, but Shadowshaper, and also Let Me Hear It Rhyme take place in, both of those take place in like Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn area, and it's really cool to hear them talk about all the places that I know our kids have been, like on Fulton Street, and actually in Let Me Hear It Rhyme, she talks about she, because it's the author, but one of the main characters talks about getting dropped off on J Street to walk 1 block to school. So,
yeah. In
could
PSB
be
11,
Westinghouse.
They totally talk about like walking down Atlantic Ave. They're living around like the Bed-Stuy Crown Heights border. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah. So I listened to Shadowshaper on audiobook, and I'm just going to make a big shout out. I think the audiobook really made this book for me. This is the first in a trilogy that follows our main character, who is an aspiring artist, a graffiti artist, and she notices in Brooklyn that some of the murals of these famous folks are starting to fade, and eventually like the murals start crying. And so it's this like kind of mystery, magical realism. She learns that she is a shadow shaper. I mean, that's not really a spoiler because it's the name of the book. And she gets these powers, or they're like passed down from her grandfather, who recently had a stroke and is telling her, his last words almost are that she's in danger and she needs to find this person, Robbie, who's another graffiti artist. So I thought it was really cool. She is, trying to save. It's very much a good versus evil story. Some of the things I liked, I loved that there was a university librarian who helps them solve, get access to the archival materials that they need. I thought that was really cool. I thought the teen dialogue was really awesome. They used some of the same slang that they used in Let Me Hear a Rhyme. And actually in Let Me Hear a Rhyme, there's a glossary to teen slang, just in case you didn't know what dead ass meant. It's defined in there for you.
Well, interestingly, when I'm not originally from Brooklyn, which is one of the reasons I love reading books set in Brooklyn, because it helps me learn about where I live. And deadass was not a word that I was as familiar with. And when I moved here, folks told me deadass is a Brooklyn word.
It is. I thought it was like a recent thing, but like the fact that it was in the book about the 90s made me realize that probably not. And yeah, so some of the same slang I felt like showed up in Shadowshaper as well. I loved that there was like this Latinx folklore woven into this, and also some talk about like colorism, racism, and like fighting gentrification. I thought that was really cool themes that also kind of reminded me of Pride, which we'll talk about in a little bit. I think it was pretty short. And I think this would be really great for fans of Pet or Akata Witch or Miles Morales, which I'll talk about in a second. The like good versus evil, the magical realism, the like set in Brooklyn, but also magic, I think would be great. So it's also available in Spanish, which I thought was cool. And this is book 1 of a trilogy. And then there's like 2 kind of in between novels. So there's 5 books altogether if you're really into it.
My turn next. Okay, so Last Summer with Maizon follows the main character, whose name is actually Margaret, and her best friend, Maizon. Margaret is living in Bed-Stuy. So again, we have a book set in a neighborhood that maybe we're familiar with. And Margaret and Maizon, they're in middle school. Their friendship isn't perfect. They fight, they envy each other a little bit. They don't always show each other how important their friendship is to each of them. But then Maizon has this opportunity to maybe go to a better school that is outside the city. And Margaret has to come to terms with what it would mean to have her best friend move away. At the same time, she's dealing with the fact that her father is very ill, and she's really worried about potentially losing him. So there's this theme of loss and dealing with loss that is really central to the book, but even more than that is the ways that Margaret learns to deal with that. So she learns to express herself through writing. She has this like really sweet, encouraging teacher who helps her understand new ways to express herself. She learns to really take pride in what she has to say and in what she's feeling. This book deals with a lot of important issues like race and class and education, education disparities in different parts of our city, as well as our city and outside our city, as the main characters really navigate their own school in Bed-Stuy and think about what kind of education other folks are getting. So I loved this book. I just was so overcome by reading it. I loved it. And I think that it would also be a great book for starting a lot of good conversations.
So we have a few more. Yeah, we got a few more that they just didn't have the same number of copies available, but we couldn't not talk about them. So Jen, you want to tackle the first one?
Sure.
First few?
Okay. Yeah, I'll talk about the first couple. So the first one I want to talk about is A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, and this one might be pretty familiar to folks. I know it ends up on a lot of required reading lists or ELA syllabi. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn is a real classic. And it is set in the early 20th century in Williamsburg. And we get to follow just the story of a teenage girl growing up in Brooklyn. We learn about what it's like to be an immigrant in Brooklyn at that time, what working conditions were like, what life opportunities were like for young women. It's really engaging, and I found it really enjoyable and easy to read. So while it's often a book that folks have to read, you should just like count this as something fun on your required reading list. And if it isn't on a list of books that you have to read, maybe just like check it out anyways.
This book, I learned the word, I'm going to mess it up. Bildungsroman.
Bildungsroman?
Yeah.
I don't know if I said that right, but yeah.
I didn't know what that was until this book.
There you go.
And so if you don't know what it is, it's a very long word that pretty much just means coming of age story.
Yeah. The next book that I want to talk about is Decoded by Jay-Z. And I'll just like tell you a funny, embarrassing story about myself and Jay-Z. Oh, and Rachel has pointed out that he went to Westinghouse. So because I'm not from the United States, when I ride the train line that goes through the part of Brooklyn that Jay-Z grew up in, I refer to it as the JZ line. And it wasn't until I had been working at Brooklyn Connections for a while that one of my colleagues mentioned to me, oh, Jay-Z picked his name because that's the name of the train line through his neighborhood. And I was like, there's no Jay-Z line. That's not a line. Turns out there is, if you say it the American way. But Decoded is part autobiography, part history of hip hop, reflection on hip hop. It includes a lot of images and lyrics from his songs. So if you are a Jay-Z fan, if you're a hip hop fan, I think you'll like this. Also, I read the book on an e-reader. So I was reading the ebook version. When you look at the book, like the actual physical book, it's, I think, like a really like large, beautiful book filled with lots of visuals. So I was pretty worried that reading the ebook version would not be as compelling, but it did translate pretty well still to my small e-reader. It was like the images weren't janky. The lyrics showed up well. So it was still like a visually fairly satisfying experience on an e-reader. Although I'm sure not what the gorgeous book is like. And then the other book that I want to mention here is Pride by Ibi Zoboi, which I first heard about because it was mentioned several weeks back on What to Read This Weekend. And I read it and loved it. It is set in Bed-Stuy. It is a retelling of the Pride and Prejudice story. But if you haven't read Pride and Prejudice, that's fine. Secret, I haven't read Pride and Prejudice. But I read this book, I loved it. So of course there's a love story in there because it's based on a book that deals with themes of love, but it's also dealing with issues of race and gentrification and displacement as a result of gentrification. And it's a great book.
Yes, I loved it. It's so good. And the audiobook version of Pride is narrated by Elizabeth Acevedo, who is a spoken word performer as well as an author. So it was really good in audiobook as well. Miles Morales is the story. This is a novel, although it's loosely based on the Marvel comics of Miles Morales Spider-Man. It's kind of like a reimagining or a retelling of Spider-Man as a Latinx kid from Brooklyn. And you can see like the train lines that look like it's either over Atlantic or over Broadway on the main page. And this also takes place in Brooklyn. You'll see places, Peaches in Bed-Stuy is mentioned, Promenade is mentioned. So like places that you would recognize, which I thought was really cool. And Miles Morales is it's a story of good and evil. He's fighting white supremacy through this like terribly racist professor at his school, teacher at his school. It's a private school. So the Brooklyn Visions Academy, I think. But I really like this by Jason Reynolds, and pretty much anything by Jason Reynolds. Like No Other by Una LaMarche is a story of Devora. It takes place in Crown Heights, of Devora and Jackson, or Jax. And Devora is a Hasidic Jewish girl, and Jax would probably proclaim himself as like a Black nerd. And it's kind of a story of just really deep religious beliefs, and also kind of deciding how you want to live your life, maybe differently than how you grew up, or like coming to terms with you know, our current generation versus the generation of our parents. And I've heard this compared to like Romeo and Juliet a little bit. But this was really good. It was also an AudiobookSYNC pick earlier in the summer. So the cover looks a little bit different, but shout out to AudiobookSYNC for always having really awesome picks. Brooklyn Bruja series. This is actually, Bruja Born is actually the second book in the series. The first one is Labyrinth Lost. And this is a trilogy by, I wrote this down, Zoraida Cordova. I hope I said her name right. And it's a paranormal, like magic story with an all POC, people of color cast. It's really cool. The main character is a bisexual Latinx girl, and it's kind of like Alice in Wonderland retelling meets Pan's Labyrinth. So I thought this was cool, and it also takes place in Brooklyn. The series, although the book isn't called Brooklyn Brujas, the series is called Brooklyn Brujas. So, and all of these books are available at Libby or Sora. So we've talked a lot about Sora. I just want to share that Sora is the audiobook platform that we recently acquired through the New York City Department of Education. And it is an e-reading platform that syncs with the public library that provides access to kids, children's, juvenile, and young adult books. So it is its own app, and I was going to show you where you can read all of these books. You might be familiar with Sora because it actually is the platform that AudiobookSYNC is using this year. So you can read all of your books in one place. I think the best part about this is that you can search all of them. You can add, so you're getting all of the New York City Department of Ed picks, plus Queens Public Library, Brooklyn Public Library, and New York Public Library, and AudiobookSYNC. So you're searching like 5 catalogs at once, which is really awesome. The only downside I will say is that some of the like traditionally adult books, like adult books for young adults, like A Tree Grows in Brooklyn and Decoded, they aren't available on Sora, but it's actually a sister product to Libby. So you can use either or. They will sync automatically. So what you download on one will be available on the other, which I really love. So that's all we have today. AudiobookSYNC has Christmas in July this week, A Christmas Carol, and Twelfth Night. So if you want to download those this week, and then there's only a few more weeks left. And next week, we will welcome back Marie, our Princess Diva. We've missed her. And join us next week. You can see all of our show notes and all the books we selected this week and previous weeks at bit.ly/w2rtw2020.